Welcome to my guide for an Evoker. This is a combination of Earth Mastery and Dream Mastery, and this was my attempt at a Reflect-based character. So I'm not going to go over the Reflect mechanics, they're pretty intense. I made a separate video to go alongside this build video for that, and you can find that in my mechanics section, my playlist for mechanics. I'm going to focus on just this combination and how this character plays. And the only other thing I'll mention in the intro here is that because of Ragnarok and its new itemization, particularly just ice scale gear, you're able to be very flexible with your mastery choice. Before, it was very oriented towards Dream and Defense and Earth. I would still recommend playing within those, but you can feel free to do pretty much anything you want. So I'm going to throw up the build charts on the screen now for those of you who just want to see the skill point allocations and where you assign your attributes as you level. But for the rest of you, stay put. I'll do lots of explanations, of course, as I always do. While the charts are on screen, I'll do the pros and cons. So first, this is a great starter Reflect character. So if you're looking to get into Reflect, I think this is great, mostly because it's blessed by having Earth Mastery. Earth Mastery just provides you with your entire early and mid game on its own. It starts to scale off a little bit into Legendary, but in normal and epic, between Ring of Fire and Eruption, you are good to go. And it relies on this very stable combination, which we'll talk about later, of Stone Form and Reflect. A weakness then, it's not the best late game. You're kind of paying for that really solid early game by not having the most stable end game. This character actually died a few times in the end game. If you watch my stream, you're probably rolling your eyes. I played on X-Max, so don't give me too much crap, but I think something more tanky would have a lot better of a time. I did make this very critical mistake at the end game, which was trying to prioritize health. I was at this threshold where I had a bunch of attribute points, decided to tunnel into health rather than dexterity, and get health gear instead of DA gear. That was a big mistake. It turns out your biggest enemy with Reflect-based characters is melee damage in the late game. Act 5 hits very hard, so having a solid amount of DA is very important. Shoot for like 1200 in Legendary, at least 1000. I think I had something like 700. It was not survivable. Another strength then, and you could take this as a strength or a weakness depending on how you look at it, but it's very, very light on your skill point needs. I found this sort of frustrating, actually. There weren't enough useful abilities to go along with my build, if I was being honest. Most skills were just kind of fluffy, they didn't add much, and a lot of skills and a lot of the masteries are actual anti-synergies, so using them would be detrimental, like summoning pets in my case. I couldn't make use of Core Dweller, I tried, I couldn't make use of many stuns, they just weren't working out for me. But you might be a person who kind of prefers that, you're sick of playing builds where skill points are so incredibly tight, and you need more and more plus skills gear just so you can take the abundance over the +4 and allocate them somewhere else. Well, just note that you still need to max your skills. You still need the +4, the ones you do have. But I think in this character, unless I forced it out, I probably ended up with like 20 skill points left over. A weakness then, it's got limited gear options. So I say this because Reflect it has some itemization. It's got prismatic amulets and new Golem Heart, new Ice Scale gear. It has Athena's, it has some other Reflect gear. But there's not too much of it. You know what I mean? Like, you can't scale just intellect and be good with Reflect. A lot of Reflect is on strength gear. And I find that in the end, you're kind of stuck with the Ice Scale gear. It's just too good not to use. Beforehand, I think people mostly utilized the masteries themselves to provide Reflect, but nowadays you can get a lot of Reflect through your gear, and you should. But again, those options are limited. You can play the old school way and just build something tanky, or something in between, which is what I think I might do. So you have some ice scale gear that's well rolled, and some of the really nice, powerful Ionius type of gear. But if you're just looking to stack tons and tons of Reflect, you're limited in the sense that you have to use the Ice Scale gear, and because of that, you need to have it very well rolled to account for your resists. It doesn't have any native resists. And if you want to use Golem's Heart or Golem's Blood, whatever that thing is, you have to know that you have opportunity costs there. You can't use Dionysus Wineskin or Demon's Blood if you're using those things. So you might have to buy your way into them. Typically, the only way to do that is to have access to all these other really overpowered items. which you do, but just note that every time you try to fix something in your build, you're likely taking away from your reflect. That's what I mean by limited gear options. Another strength, and this is probably the major strength, is that your damage scales incredibly well. Why? Because it scales exactly off of your enemy's damage. So you don't have to do a darn thing about your damage at all. There's no you level up and it increases your reflect damage. That works for retaliate. This is not retaliate. Reflect, the game doesn't give you anything to scale it, except for the fact that the mobs themselves are doing more damage. This means that you could just go through the entire game with the same amount of reflect, and you'll see proportionally the same or sometimes even better value out of it. For instance, hard-hitting enemies like Grandmaster Archers, they're going to kill themselves in like 2 hits. The last con then, there's many anti-synergies. I touched on this with the masteries, but you'll be looking through the mastery trees and see things like Ravages of Time and Spirit, and I know I wanted to create this Life Leech Retaliation / Reflect build. Would have been awesome, man, but it turns out in my own testing that Ravages of Time is a big anti-synergy. If you didn't know, that's tied to Death Chill Aura, and it gives this really nice damage resistance buff to you, or it's actually a damage debuff to your enemy, ticks every 1 second. And it's pretty much defined Spirit. In my opinion, you can't really play Spirit without Ravages of Time. It's just too good. But unfortunately, that exact type of damage reduction does impact your reflect damage. Now, a couple of people in my chat are okay with that. They're spitballing some builds and said, I'm fine with the, damage reduction from Plague. I forget what it's called, Fatigue, I think. They're okay with Ravages of Time. Because they can make use of it to survive, that's fine, and reflect damage is okay on its own. So you can make that sort of judgment call too, but it's not just that. There's things like stuns. If you're going to take damage and proc a stun, kind of like in Storm Mastery, I think it's called Storm Nimbus. That sort of thing is a huge anti-synergy. I think the classic example is Athena's Mirrored Shield itself. You'd think this thing is the perfect itemization for this build. It gives a solid 50% damage reflected, but it also comes native with this 10% chance to stun for like 3 to 5 seconds, something like that. That thing killed me more times than I care to even talk about, frankly. Why? Because this build, the Evoker, is so reliant on this combination of stone form and reflect that if you're in stone form and you have 6 or 7 El Jotun or something that are wailing on you and they do tons of damage and they stun themselves, you've just wasted a critical 3 to 5. I've seen back-to-back stuns. It's 10% chance. It's a lot of stuns. I've seen minions just sit there stunned the whole time I'm in stone form, and guess what they're ready to do when I'm out? They're ready to just massacre me, and that's exactly what they did. I need them to die during stone form. And I would argue that any build that utilizes stone form and reflect cannot take things like Athena's Mirrored Shield. It's uncontrollable forms of stun. Something controllable like Battle Horn or some other stun or CC like that might be advantageous. Flash Powder. Actually, Flash Powder would be amazing now that I'm thinking about it. But anyway, there's a lot of anti-synergies that are built into gear and masteries. You're going to want to learn them, look out for them, test them, see how they feel. Watch my guide, my mechanics guide on Reflect if you want to know more about these anti-synergies and what to look for. And of course, Stone Form. I talked about this thing being the staple of the build. I built this character as a Typhon killer. I was going to do a challenge on X-Max where you go through the whole game playing X-Max so it triples the bosses, and I was going to see if I could not die. Well, spoiler, I did die a lot. I was practicing. To be honest, I was learning X-Max. I haven't played it in a very long time. But I was worried about my nemesis, good old Typhon, and I made this character specifically to counter him. Good news, it worked flawlessly against Typhon. He just dies like nothing against... I killed him like 100 times farming items. It felt great. And the reason this character is so good against Typhon is he does a ton of damage when he auto-attacks, especially on Legendary. And he does a ton of life leech, but he needs to hit you with it before he leeches his own life. And he does ridiculous asinine meteor damage, so does Barmanu. He's a little bit more dangerous though. So all you have to do is engage Typhon, wait for him to throw up his arms or whatever he does to call the meteors, then sit in stone form, and he'll probably kill himself with that hit alone, as long as your Arcane Mirror procs. Sometimes it'll take that and a couple swings, but this character is amazing for killing a lot of bosses, especially the ones that have OP attacks. Typhon, Barmanu, the Act 2 Telkine with his fire beams ability that could be reflected if you stand in it in earth form. Stuff like that. Very, very good. So moving on then, the typical topics for this style of video I lay out the type of character this is. Is it a spellcaster? Is it an attack-based character, a range character? This is definitely unique, but I would call it a spellcaster. You use a lot of Ring of Fire and a lot of Eruption in normal and epic. By legendary, you're mostly casting stone form, but you're not really attacking very much. Your attack damage is pitiful. I ended up using a Blessing of the Moray for an endgame piece of item. That's actually a really good item, but I'm not scaling it at all, really. So you're not going to be attacking, you're not really even going to be casting spells in legendary. You're mostly a target dummy. I'd say that's the most apt description of what you are. You want to get hit, you taunt enemies, you want them to attack you, and then you sit in stone form, and you're a nice little target dummy so the enemy can test their damage numbers, their DPS, and show it off to their friends. But haha, you fooled them, they're dead. And then attributes then, well, you probably saw this on the charts, but if you're listening along, of course, dexterity for Stonebinder's Cuffs, that's the typical benchmark I always use for my characters. The reason for that is you're going to have to balance your health with your dexterity. I find that if you go too much on one over the other inside your attributes, then it's very hard to compensate one way or another. Unless you know exactly what you're going to be wearing by the end of the game, it's much, much better for your characters just to get a moderate amount of baseline health, go with benchmarks throughout the game, and just get this moderate amount of benchmark DA. And a big portion of your DA comes from your dexterity. And Stonebinder's Cuffs are amazing for every character, so it's just an amazing benchmark. Now, I didn't get that with this character. I opted to use some minus requirements gear to equip my stuff. That ended up biting me in the butt. I could not get enough DA by the end game to save my life, literally. And I really needed some more, so I was really kicking myself for not meeting my own benchmark. It's kind of like a shame on me sort of thing. But anyway, your main attribute will be strength. That's because ice scale gear requires strength. Do you have to use ice scale gear? No. Past builds weren't tied to ice scale because it didn't exist. But I would say you are gimping yourself pretty severely if you don't use ice scale gear. Look at the magnitudes on it. The epic version is 15% chance of 350% damage. All of those bonuses stack with each other, and other bonuses too. It's just too good not to use. Now, you can't get the legendary ice scales, which we'll talk about later, so you're okay just meeting the epic requirements. Coincidentally, the epic shields are actually good enough, unless you're playing defense, in which case you want to scale your shields. But if you're not playing defense, like this Evoker, it's more than fine just getting the epic levels of strength instead of the legendary levels of strength. So that's, 400 instead of 600. That way he's got some more attributes to play with in terms of his health and his dexterity. I felt like that was good for an Evoker. So for an Evoker, I would just get strength up to into the epic levels unless you really want to equip a nice shield like Ionius, which is very tempting. And of course, in terms of weapons, you're going sword and board. There's a lot of good shields out there. I mentioned Ionius. There's a lot of good swords out there that open up builds. I know I like the sword of the Glauberg Prince. I think that would be a nice endgame sword for a Juggernaut. So there's a lot of good stuff you can get sword and board. Plus, shields can take care of pretty much all of your pierce res while you're progressing through the game. So this is pre-Ionius or any of that stuff. So I really recommend just going sword and board. So you're going to need at least enough strength to equip decent shields, which is about 400 strength, maybe 350. And about gear, since we're kind of in that area now, is you don't need to scale your damage at all. So feel free not to. You could just wear the gear that gives reflect, wear some gear that gives resists, health, DA. That's all you need. Other forms of damage are great, like chance to avoid projectiles, which is built into ice scale. And more importantly, dodge. For this character, dodge is very, very important. And you just want to stack those defenses as much as humanly possible. The more defenses you have, just the typical defenses, the better. They're not going to affect your retaliate damage at all. Again, go watch the video if you want to know more about the mechanics. And you also want a lot of recharge, minus recharge on your gear. I think I had about 40% on this character. I would say that's a good amount to shoot for. A little bit more would be even better. The reason for that is you get so much momentum out of your earth form, your stone form, from Earth Mastery. You want to go into it as often as possible. It saves your life, it does the bulk of your damage, plus it synergizes very well with your arcane shield. If you see your arcane shield proc, your arcane mirror, which is an artifact, if you see that proc, then you know you can go really, really super aggressive as long as your stone form is up. So minus recharge just helps those situations align a lot better. It saves your life a lot more often, and it allows you to be a lot more aggressive in general. And lastly, you're going to be looking for as many reflect pieces as you can possibly get. I'm actually going to switch over to a window capture here, so I can show you exactly what that looks like. So I've got here on the Titan Quest database a whole bunch of the ice scale gear. This is just the chest piece. Note that you can also get the helm, the bracers, and the boots. They all do the exact same thing. This 15% chance of damage and a chance to avoid projectiles. Projectiles aren't a big issue with this character. Usually it is pretty dangerous fighting Grandmaster archers, but not if they kill themselves in 2 hits. Especially not if they kill themselves in 2 hits in stone form. But anyway, you can't actually get the legendary ice scale armor. I tried farming it myself, and my suspicions were probably confirmed by someone in my chat who looked through the loot tables, and there seems to be an error preventing the legendary pieces from being able to drop. If you have found this before and you haven't changed your game or anything, let me know. I'd be very interested to see, but I've tried farming these things on multiple playthroughs and it doesn't work out. So I'm going to assume that you're still watching and this is still bugged. So I went with this epic stuff. Now, I was only able to equip the boots, so I didn't even have everything. And that was because I just didn't have my defenses where I wanted them. But conceivably, you could really roll, ideally, veterans ice scale armor, or ice scale armor with decent resists and a health suffix or a DA suffix, something like that. Just get a very well-rolled epic. Use all of your energy for farming to farm the epic pieces. You're going to be wearing that for most of the game. And these bonuses stack. So if you had 4 of these, it would be like a 45% chance to do something, but all of those things could also align all at once. So I describe it like rolling a 100-sided dice. If you have 4 pieces of ice scale gear, each one of them can roll 1 to 15. Let's just say that's the sweet spot. In which case, all of them will proc their 350% damage, and they will add together. So your bonus would be like, 1100 damage or whatever that is. That's enormous. That's a huge amount of damage. It'll kill pretty much anything. But even if they don't all proc at once, it's very likely that you'll get one of them to proc. The more of these you have, the more consistent you'll be reflecting with these odds. And 350, like I said, is just a ridiculous magnitude. So of course you can get those full set headpiece, chest piece, arms, boots. You can enchant them with their own charms and relics. There is a new reflect charm with Ragnarok called Golem something. Golem's Heart. So let's look at the legendary one actually. Here it is. 50% chance at 60% damage reflected. Not that great. Statistically, that works out to about 30% flat damage reflected. It's not amazing, but if you could buy your way into this, and again, it's rings and amulets, so you'd have to have something that gives a lot of vitality res. Otherwise, you're going to have to use Demon's Blood. But if you can buy your way into this, hey, that just gives you a goal for your character. Conceivably, you'd have a full set of ice scale. You'd have 3 Golem's Hearts. You'd have a prismatic amulet, maybe with one of the Golem's Heart in it. So if we look at Prismatic can give you 12% damage reflected. I've seen this go as high as about 20, and this goes high as about 30, so this is like an average roll. And of all the things I've showed you, this Prismatic prefix is the only thing that's existed before Ragnarok. Everything else, the Golem's Heart and all the ice scale gear, that's come after Ragnarok. So it's pretty incredible. The expansion has just added so much flexibility to creating reflect characters that you can pretty much do everything you want. Before, you were very much tied to your masteries. So an Evoker would definitely use as much of this as he could get away with. Mine couldn't get away with too much. Luckily, an Evoker is very much held up by their masteries themselves. We'll see that when we go in game. But I have a lot of ways of just passively generating reflect through my masteries, so those could hold me up a little bit. And the last piece, of course, is going to be the artifact. pretty much a staple of the build is this Arcane Mirror. Energy Leech resistance is very, very important. Life Leech resistance, great for Typhon. 15% chance of 100% damage reflected. But the big deal is actually this proc. It's just 300% damage reflected, always up, for 12 seconds on a 2-minute cooldown. That doesn't seem great, especially since you can't control it. You don't activate this skill. You just get hit, and eventually it procs. But trust me, it procs. And you'll notice it on your icon on the top left part of your screen underneath your health bar. And you'll recognize it on your character also. This is on the center of your screen, there's like a graphic. It looks kind of like Heat Shield from Earth Mastery. You'll see that go off and you'll know it's game time. You want to find some aggressive pull, herd a bunch of enemies together. Hopefully you already are playing aggressively. That way you can make use of Arcane Mirror when it procs. Maybe you're fighting a boss and you're trying to bait the Arcane Mirror into happening before you go crazy on the boss. And by go crazy, I mean run up to him in stone form. That's how this character goes crazy. But anyway, you can make use of this cooldown. You'll learn how to do it. I was let down at first, but I was very, very much propped up after I figured out how to use this to my best ability. And it just massacres things. If it procs in the middle of a room with Mackay archers, you're kind of like Sylvester Stallone from that Expendables movie. If you ever saw the preview, like at the movie theaters, where some sniper's looking at him and he's surrounded by all these enemies and he just kind of has this thing in his glove that shoots everything around him. You're kind of like that. It's a lot of fun. So next, of course, we're going to go into the build itself. Of course, if you saw the build charts at the beginning, you'll kind of know on a high level what I'm about to talk about here. But let's talk about progression. So you're going to start off leveling fire. If you are Earth Mastery as part of your build at all, you are in for a good time, my friend. It is a joy to play. Just beeline up to Ring of Flame. You can get this thing, I think, at level 3 math, right? So that's 3, yeah, level 3. And it just keeps getting better and better. You might want to stop it at about 10. The active energy cost becomes a little bit insane after that. But that's okay. This thing massacres the whole map. And once it actually works out very nicely, because once this thing starts to become a little bit less effective, you'll be well in range for Eruption. And getting Eruption is just another gold mine. It feels just as good as getting Ring of Flame. This thing kills bosses like no other. It synergizes very well with Reflect in Epic mode, but more importantly, it helps you in normal mode. You're not going to have your Reflect tools in normal mode. Your Reflect is going to be very tame, so you're going to heavily rely on, for your damage, Eruption and Ring of Fire. I can't imagine what other builds have to do. Well, I can, and it sucks. But you have Earth Mastery as an Evoker, so I recommend you use it, and just tunnel into Ring of Flame, and then later tunnel into Eruption. Of course, in the early game as well, you can get Trance of Empathy. This is the other part of that combo. You want some nice baseline Reflect. You can see when it's +4, it's got 85% damage reflected. We don't care about the Leech. We're not an attack-based character. But you could get this in the early game. Just note it's going to be somewhere around 40, or was it? It's 60%, I think, when you have it fully invested. That's 12 points, though. So it's up to you, really. There's not a whole lot in Dream that I would recommend in the early game. I mean, yeah, DA is nice and you can get that, but really your goal is to get Eruption after Ring of Flame. It's really about Act 3. Like, before Typhon, definitely you want Eruption. But before Act 3, Ring of Flame starts to die out in power. Around, I don't know, Chang'an or so in Act 3. You'll notice it start to die out. It's not enough to carry you on its own. Of course, you could beeline into Trance of Wrath, but that takes 32 points here. I highly recommend you instead go 32 points here and get Eruption. This thing's going to do a lot better for you. Being an Auramancer is overrated. So again, I'd say the bulk of your Reflect starts at Typhon, when you can get your Trance of Empathy. Of course, you'll have Stone Form with Molten Rock to add 2 seconds. And that between your gear, like a well-rolled Prismatic Amulet, this isn't very good, but you could see that the reflected damage goes up to about 20. The elemental resistances go pretty high. Again, we don't care about the flat damage. But you'll start to have this and maybe a couple of other pieces of gear that do reflected damage. And with that, you'll be able to kill Typhon very easily. Even if you don't have any Reflect, you'll be able to kill him with Eruption. I would say it's not about until epic mode you can see some of the equip requirements, and especially these boots. It's not until epic that you can really make use of reflect. If you want to twink your character, you can just mail him some of the epic ice scale gear. They can equip it by, I don't know, Act 5 normal, and you can start being a beast right away. I mean, by all means, you're going to be wearing that same ice scale gear for the rest of the game, most likely. So that would be very effective, but if you're not twinking your gear, even if you don't have any inheritance whatsoever, you can play this character. Just note that you have to farm the ice scale gear once you get to Act 5 on both difficulties, and you're very much going to rely on good old Earth Mastery. And honestly, if you were to ask me what else you should get for your build, this goes back to that part I said earlier. There's really nothing you can get. A lot of what I took here is totally pointless. Is just to spend something on skills. I should have stuff in Distortion Field, just so you know. But like, I took this whole line with Psionic Burn and Psionic Touch. That does nothing. I barely ever attack at all. The slow's kind of nice, but again, I don't do anything with this. I got a whole bunch into Trance of Wrath, even though I never ever use it ever. The DA is useful here, but this is almost completely useless. I maxed it out. Why? Don't ask me, dude. I don't know. Temporal Flux is incidentally very good. You want a little bit of cast speed with every build, in my opinion, if you can weave it in somewhere. And Chance to Avoid Projectiles, you'd think that's an anti-synergy, but it's not. Anything that's part of the damage order gets ignored when it comes to Reflect, so if you avoid the projectile, the enemy still takes the full damage. And of course, Distort Reality, the only time I ever use this is if I'm in stone form, and the things around me aren't dead yet, then I spam Distort Reality so I can get it off immediately when stone form ends. Oops, I had my thing on. But anyway, you can kind of get the idea there. And that's just a stun thing so I can get away and reposition. It doesn't always save your life though, and I wouldn't really use it offensively. And you're not really using it to scale your damage. All of your damage comes from Reflect. So honestly, where do you spend your points? Well, any tiny little thing that will give you some amount of defense boost without actively having to apply it. So of course, slower movement is somewhat defensible, but I have to actively apply this. It's every third attack. This, however, Distortion Field, the recharge is reduced with recharge reduction. That synergizes with our build. You can see if well, I'm actually kind of afraid to take things off because it ruins everything. Let me do it. You can see exactly what I mean. So if I take that off, you can see that it's got 30-second recharge. And if I upgrade it at 1 point, it's 30-second recharge. Well, this recharge gets reduced with minus recharge. That means the uptime on Distortion Field, especially on X Max when things are hitting you a lot, is very, very good. So if I try to equip my Blessing of the Moray again, can I even do this? There we go. I had to buy these boots just for that. Then you'll see 18-second recharge, 15-second duration. Now the activation chance is very low, so the uptime is more like 50%. But that's 26% damage absorption. That's really good, plus 51 flat damage absorption. So any little thing like this is helpful. Pets I found to be very anti-synergy. You can use Summon Nightmare. He's gonna take some of those mobs and aggro them onto him, though. That's not what you want. You want to be killing the mobs. You want to have mob control. You want to be able to see some mobs and say, I've aggroed them. I want to kill them here, now. You don't want some of them to go to your pet and some of them to go to you. You can try it. I didn't try Nightmare. I tried Earthman, and it just didn't work out. So sometimes squeezing a little bit out of your defense, and of course pets are very defensible. In this case, it meant that I would have a lesser control over mob manipulation, and I felt like that was just too bad. I needed more control. To me, that was what was defensible. Not having the pet, but the mob control. Plus, I wanted to play very aggressively. And with pets, you kind of have to wait for them. They'll just die if you play too aggressively. Or they'll just go off and play solo campaign. They'll do their own thing. So I wanted to just opt away from pets. I wanted to make them work, but it just couldn't. Things like Phantom Strike, you could put 1 point here just to kind of teleport away, get away from creatures. I didn't do that. But you could see, I mean, Sands Asleep, I guess I could use this. I don't know, I never did. I put points into it, but I never used it. It just becomes very difficult to spend points into things. I would say your main things are Temporal Flux, Trance of Empathy, Premonition, Distortion Field, and maybe Temporal Rift in this tree, and that's it, really. And then in Earth Mastery, you can get a little bit of mileage out of Stone Skin for the armor. That's pretty good, actually. And you get Ring of Flame, which I honestly don't need anymore. It's kind of an anti-synergy at this point. If my mana gets drained, guess what? I lose my Trance of Empathy. If that happens while I'm in stone form, I'm probably not going to kill those giant monsters who are attacking me. And if that happens, then they're still going to be alive when I'm out of stone form and they're ready to kill me. So that's actually a pretty bad news. Sometimes I don't even use Ring of Flame, unless I'm just running through a bunch of easy-to-kill mobs. And then, of course, stone form. I didn't even have to max this out. I just did because I had the points. The tiny bit of health regen there, I didn't have any synergies with that. I'm not using Trans of Convalescence. So, you see what I mean. There's not a lot you can do, so just try to get the things that give you a tiny amount of defense, as annoying as Heat Shield is with its stupid, dumb 100-second duration. It gives 15% physical res. I can't not use that. And the damage absorbed versus fire, pretty good. So you can see, not very complicated with the skills. Where this build shines is the fact that it has Earth Mastery to begin with. This solves your early and mid game, which is kind of a problem for Reflect characters, especially if they don't inherit gear. And it gives you this really nice combo with Stone Form, Molten Rock, and your just regular Trance of Empathy and any other Reflect you have stacked. Of course, you can use Stone Form. I think there's an item that grants it. I'm not sure if it gives you the full damage absorption, though. Bracers of Atlas or whatever. I would have to test it, but let it suffice to say that Earth is very unique in what it gives to Reflect builds. And Dream, of course, just gives you that really nice baseline reflection damage. Honestly, if I were to replace any tree, it would be this one, and that's exactly what I'm thinking I would do. I'd trade Dream for defense to make a Juggernaut. I think that would be a better Reflect character. But that's for another video. For the purposes of this video, just know that Dream does have its place. This baseline Reflect is not to be discounted. It's amazing. It's always up, which means you don't have to time it the way you do with defense. Once you have gear, that's no longer an issue, which is why I say this is not a very good endgame character. But as a starter Reflect character, Evoker, Earth Dream, I think is the best. And onto my gear then. So if we take a look at my gear, of course, I only have one piece of ice scale gear. I have another one somewhere. Yeah, I have these bracers. They're pretty bad. But because I can't really afford to lose any resists, this is legendary. You can see my resists aren't amazing. Minus 100 bleed. I could swap to that in an instant, I think. Right? Is that right? Yeah, I can max that out with just those two items. But still, as a baseline, I don't have enough. This is kind of dicey. Again, you're all about defense. You want to play aggressively, so you're going to take a lot of damage. My real hurdle was dealing with my defensive ability. I only have 360 dex. That is so low. And I opted to get health instead of DA on a lot of my stuff. That was a big mistake. So you see my typical rings. I don't usually have anything special. I opted to play with my attributes a little bit more than I should have. So I got stuff like this % strength ring, and I think I got minus requirements somewhere else. Yeah, I have it in my Blessing of the Moray. So I went with this very, unstable thing where if I equip one item, then I can't use anything. I did that sort of thing. I played with my attributes a little bit too much. I recommend just keeping it simple. Farm some items that give a lot of resists on them. That way you can buy yourself into more ice scale gear. The most important thing you can do on this character is just to farm really, really good ice scale gear. All of them. Again, you can only get the epic right now until the devs fix the legendary version. So that's pretty easy to farm. It's just epic Ichthyans. I recommend you use Eponas for that because it gives you some entrapment reduction. I've got this prismatic amulet. I would love a better suffix of power, just does not gel with what I want. I have way too much energy. I didn't put anything in energy, it's just how it happened. I use Stonebinder's Cuffs. I feel like every character would still use Stonebinder's Cuffs. It would almost be liberating, actually, to step away from Dream, because then I don't have to get the +4 skills in order to max my Trance of Empathy, which just seems very important. If you're using Earth Mastery, like who cares if you don't get the full regen on your stone form? And by the end of the game, Eruption doesn't do anything anyway. And you only need the bare minimum into Heat Shield, so Earth Mastery is great for not using Stonebinder's Cuffs for this build. Dream Mastery, Temporal Flux gets neutered, so does Trance of Empathy. I think with defense you can get away with not having maxed out Rally and stuff like that, so I think in that character you could use Ice Scale Bracers. But it's really hard, as you know, to get rid of Stonebinder's Cuffs on every character, so it's going to be up to you what you want to do there. I would say if you're going to sacrifice any piece of or of Ice Scale gear, it should be your chest piece if you are a Juggernaut, so that way you can get a higher armor chest. Or your bracers so you can wear Stonebinders. Of course, the artifact, very, very important. If my energy gets leached, I lose my Trance of Empathy. Any buff with an active energy cost, this gives 1 active energy per second, that will go away if my energy reaches 0. Any buff with no active energy cost, like Stone Form, will not get stripped. So that's something to note. Energy leech is very important if you're relying on a certain buff. It's most important for things like Spirit Mastery. If you lose your Death Chill aura, then you're dead. Stuff like that. So otherwise, this Arcane Mirror gives you some baseline reflect, and it gives me LE Res. I got pretty lucky with that. And of course, that proc we talked about earlier, it activates on taking damage. And it seems like the recharge on this granted effect does not get reduced with recharge gear. At least the tooltip doesn't change. It's hard to test that because there's a chance on taking damage when the cooldown is up. But anyway, I opted to use the Surface Plate. Bad idea, the armor's too low. I just needed the resists, and I kind of like the 10% chance of 47 damage reflect. Honestly, if you average that out, it's very, very small. So the recharge on it was also pretty nice, though. It's just altogether, I kind of felt like it was okay-ish. I would definitely be looking to equip this. I even enchanted it, so what you're seeing here is better than the normal Surface Plate. Of course, I got my Blessing of the Morai. I've had this on a few characters now. It's just so good. I think I got it to roll the elemental damage. That's non-consequential here. What I really wanted was the recharge and the reduction to requirements. Reduction to requirements is good because it means you can take points away from strength, which you're only needing to equip gear, and put it into dexterity or health. So that's just a good stat. Obviously, I get the rest of my recharge here for a total of, looks like 40% recharge. That's pretty good. Total speed, again, good for casting. It's just a good all-around item to use, and you get some resists to boot. The last thing I want to talk about is this Athena's Mirrored Shield. This thing was a blessing and a curse. Ultimately, it was a curse. I talked about it earlier, but stun retaliation is a huge anti-synergy. I might be able to test that here in a second, but if enemies get stunned, and you can tell they're stunned if they got their heads down and they're kind of shaking around a little bit. If they get stunned during my Earth form, and I had hoped to kill them during the Earth form, and they could have died during the Earth form, that's the important part. Well, they didn't die because they stunned themselves. That's a huge anti-synergy, and unfortunately that's baked into the shield itself. I feel like this was the second worst thing I did with this character. The first worst thing was tunneling too much into health instead of dex. This was the second worst. I didn't realize just how bad this was until about Legendary, and then I started testing it a little bit more. Don't use Athena's Mirror Shield. I enchanted it, so it was holding up my Pierce Res, so I couldn't quite get away from it. What I would do is equip an Ionius here. That way you could buy your way into maybe some Golem's Heart or a couple more Ice Scale pieces, preferably a chest piece. I would farm like a really good Ice Scale Helm. I have a better Crystal of Erebus too, I could use that. So there's stuff you could do with the gear. The endgame setup will look something like at least 2 pieces of Ice Scale gear. Definitely an Arcane Mirror. There's also one other item you can use here, the one that grants immortality for a little bit. That one's pretty good. Of course, they still take reflected damage when you're immortal. That was recommended by someone in chat. So there's a couple items you can play with here. Endgame, though, Prismatic Amulet, Ionius, 2 pieces of Ice Scale. Ideally, you'd have hollowed in your helm. You'd have your enchants to take care of any resists that were low, probably poison. You'd have a Blessing of the Morai. I do think this is the ideal weapon for this build. And that's about it. You might have a couple swaps here and there. So anyway, in terms of how this plays, I kind of gave a teaser to that earlier. Alright, so you gather up some mobs, and then you go into stone form. In that case, my Arcane Mirror procced. I'm very used to seeing this now. So I knew that these guys were going to die, and this is legendary, by the way. You'll see how much damage they do to me. It's crazy how fast I could die, right? So I really rely on them dying during this Earth Shield. We'll run around. Of course, you want to be as careful as you can be. If you want to buy yourself some distance while you're farming up enemies, you could do that. Just run around and let them kill themselves. That's the whole build. So let's try to find some Macae. Those are fun to kill. These Melano are fine, but we're really looking for Macae. Here we go. So archers are the best. Oh, get Sylvester Stallone. There's nothing better than watching a whole group of Macae archers just kind of die. These guys are all the melee ones, that's no fun. More melee. Here's a Grandmaster. And he's dead. I could fight like 100 Grandmasters. It makes no difference. They're very easy to manipulate. And all I have to do is just stand here. Here's Arcane Mirror. So he just got crit for 12,000. Well, he didn't get crit. He just reflected back 12,000. You can't actually crit an enemy with Reflect. If they crit you, it doesn't have an impact on their Reflect damage. And by the way, this is all you do for bosses too. You probably have seen footage of this character fighting bosses, so I don't think I need to show that. But just to see what an average run through an average place like Hades Palace is, again, this is a pretty difficult area. You can have your potion up. I honestly think having Rally on a Juggernaut would be so nice. But that's besides the point. You could do a lot of things to help farm up these minions. You could save that stun before or after. You know, for instance, if I do this and there's going to be enemies left over, I can spam the stun, and good, anything left over is now stunned and I can get away. But very, very simple playstyle. You're literally just stone forming. Sometimes this playstyle is so easy that you can just sit around and not do anything at all. Let's see if I can make that happen. So if you just want to use potions, you can do that. You can see that Arcane Mirror procced and he had stunned himself. That is a nightmare. Sometimes you're just staring at the screen like, no, kill yourself, please kill yourself. But then you have Arcane Mirror and they're stunned. It just... And then, of course, right when Arcane Mirror ends, they start hitting you without problem. They don't stun themselves again. I'm telling you, it's the most infuriating thing ever. So just do yourself a favor and don't include Athenas in your build, or any stuns that you can't control. I was a little bit, I think, overcritical of CC in my mechanics guide. So if you're watching this before or after that, just note that I'll amend that statement just to say that controllable CC is good. If you can control your CC and you're using it to your advantage to reposition, most likely that's the case, or to save your life, then it's better to CC than to die. But CC that you cannot control, like in Athena's Mirrored Shield, is a direct anti-synergy, and you should kill it with fire. In fact, I'm going to drop this thing here, and I'm going to quit the game. Actually, I have this enchanted. I would totally do it, though. So that's it for this character. He had to come along with a mechanics discussion for Reflect. I felt that it was complicated enough to warrant its own video. So if you're looking to build your own character, whatever character that might be, I scale something, probably, then go ahead and watch that video. It'll be really helpful. Otherwise, stop by on Twitch. I'm always open for questions. That's twitch.tv/Clex231. Or just stick around on YouTube. I've got more build videos on the way. Next is a Brigand. I've finished that character. And it's a glass cannon. I don't usually build glass cannons, but don't worry, it turned out great. A lot of people I know like to play bow builds. A lot of people ask about the Brigand, so that's exactly what I'll deliver there. And currently I'm playing a pet build on Twitch. It is Rogue Nature. Lots of pets. It's a lot of fun. I think it's going to be very powerful. And again, I'm not the pet lord, so I don't know much about pets. It's a good experience for me. I'll deliver to you guys what I learn. Otherwise, until next time, thanks for watching.